For this presentation, we'll be discussing industrial change in Britain between the years 1700 and 1850. Now, the main debate will be on whether revolution is an appropriate label for this time period. Now, typically, revolution refers to a short period of time where a dramatic overhaul of a certain system occurs. Now, although 150 years is a long time during this period, I will make the argument that the advancements and progressions of technology involved during this period definitely earn it the title of revolution. For doing so, we will first discuss the prerequisite circumstances for the revolution, then we will discuss the emerging nature and causes of the Industrial Revolution, and lastly we will overview the key themes and ones of particular nature especially. Now, to support the Industrial Revolution upcoming, there had to be an agricultural revolution. Now, previously, agriculture mainly consisted of fishing and fowling for food supply, whereas with the developments made, it eventually shifted towards crop farming. This is because before, fallow land had to be left for a whole year every third year. That was until the discovery of turnips and clover being used in crop rotation, which actually made this land suddenly arable. As a result, crop yield overall dramatically increased, and land reclamation was now available to previously unfertile land. This, in combination with new selective breeding techniques being better understood, we can understand from the positive agricultural loop of production that has dramatically created a boom in the food supply, ready for the Industrial Revolution. This is definitely reflected in the effect on population, as we can see from the graph here. Now, although this graph does rely on the registers of parishes, we can definitely see that such a dramatic increase of the population cannot be disregarded. Now, the main factors involved in this, as we just mentioned, is welfare population. As previously, famine was definitely an issue the United Kingdom suffered previously. Also, there are other factors, such as in 1796, Edward Jenner discovered the smallpox vaccine. This was because he noticed that cow maids were greater inoculated against the disease than the general population, and as such created a vaccine. Also, there was an increasing nuptiality rate. Now, economists argue that when an economy is growing, as it did during the Industrial Revolution, there is a low-pressure society which increases marriages. And this was reflected in stats arguing that the average woman actually got married at 21.5 years instead of 23.5 years during this time period. There was also improvements to general hygiene, as houses typically from this period onwards were built with stone or wood flooring instead of dirt before. However, that isn't to say that hygiene was solved, as cholera was still a rife issue during this time period, and densely populated areas were still a huge problem. Roads in early 18th century Britain were very limited and often had to be funded by the parishes, which had a very unstable source of income. Furthermore, the cottage industry prevalent during this time period meant that roads were in very low demand, only to be mainly used by local cities and cattle. That would be until the 1760s, where the Turnpike Act would be in full swing, as we can see from my diagram. Cities like Bristol and London, high-end trade would have a very saturated infrastructure ready for roads. This is all because of a parliamentary enacted turnpike trust system, where this allowed private investors to actually buy roads in return for maintaining the roads. Not only that, but they also then had a profit incentivization to increase the infrastructure for roads. Now, that seems all well and good for the development of infrastructure for the Industrial Revolution. However, it did come with its consequences, as cattle had to be transferred across these toll roads, and thus the cost of the toll road had to be incorporated into the price of beef, and that meant living costs went higher. Thus, poor people suffered the consequences of these toll roads the most. As mentioned before, early 18th century industry was mainly agrarian society. That meant the cottage industry, of families working inside just a cottage, and that's how most industry was, very limited. That was until the agricultural revolution we discussed, and now as a result of that, rural communities became very overpopulated, as the abundance of food created a population a rural community wasn't ready for. Now, that stimulated with enclosure acts which was the Parliament allowing private entities to buy rural land. This caused a huge stimulus for the population to be shifted elsewhere. Now, typically this would mean urban society for the eventual factories that would be built, and would also be used for mining. Now, mining was on the rise, especially since coal would be very prominent, as I will discuss later. Coal was an issue initially, as much of coal had to be dug in mine shafts nearer to the surface, as going deep meant risking flooding. However, that was until Thomas Newcomen's 1712 atmospheric engine, which utilised steam power to unflood and pump the water out of these shafts. Previously, the inventions of power before that was limited to horsepower, and they were not very efficient. Now, moving on to the actual revolution itself, there are lots of pivotal inventions which led this revolution. So just to name a few, the steam engine. Now, what we saw then was the primitive Thomas Newcomen invention. This would eventually be developed by James Watt, who would create the steam piston engine, which would be a much more efficient version with a condenser. The spinning jenny, which would massively improve textile industry. Iron bridges, which would help trade, global and within the country. And then canals as well would help shipping. As you can see from the flowchart I've designed, mass production would boom, new trade opportunities would occur as the distance travelled between each city grew, and free travel. And as you can see, prosperity was created for Britain. Now, why Britain first is one debate. Now, Eurocentrists will argue that this is just due to genetics or some other heritage reason of British nationality. However, as we can see from the debated causes, Britain certainly had its advantages, which we will discuss, and also a century-long revolution, which is the original debate we brought up at the start. Yes, I would argue it's a revolution because of these causes. Firstly, the abundance of resources and how they were utilised. So we will later examine the demand of coal and how that was sparked during this time period. An expanding labour force, as we examined in the agricultural revolution. The population dramatically increased from this time period, deservingly called a revolution. Entrepreneurs at the time were pivotal, and there were a lot of them, and notable figures we will move on to. And then there was also capital investment. So a lot of the entrepreneurs were also financial investors, which allowed a lot of factories to flourish. This could be seen very clearly in Adam Smith's 1776 Wealth of Nations, which first identified the shift from mercantilism towards capitalism, which is highly focused on production. And to focus on the importance of coal and iron, we can look at the statistics for the increasing coal demand. In the early 1700s, this was limited to only 2.7 million tonnes, and this was often used for things like nails. Eventually, as this would, in the 1850s, dramatically increase to 50 million tonnes, as their need for coke would actually spark. As coal transferred into coke makes a great resource for fuel, and that would power lots of things, such as trains in the near future. This would be paired with iron from 1793 to 1815. British iron output is tripled. Not only is this because of the need of iron, but also the measurements to receive iron also improved. And then even eventually until 1815, Britain is the largest producer of iron in Europe, and that is because of the Industrial Revolution. And the iron would particularly be useful for rails, bridges, stocks and tunnels, which we will discuss in our transport section. Now, pivotal within industry within Britain, a notable example is the cotton industry. Now, previously, cotton would be useful to turn into yarn off a single spinning wheel. However, that was revolutionised by James Hargreaves, who created the spinning jenny in 1764. Now, this dramatically improved textile production, as it went from 1 spindle to 8, so up to 8 times more production. And as cotton was actually a very cheap commodity on the global market, this was very beneficial for Britain's economy. However, to further even improve upon that, Richard Arkwright had an idea of utilising water mills, a source of power at the time, using water, and combined that to make the water mill. Now, instead of 8 spindles, as the spinning jenny, this could eventually have up to 120 mills. 120 spindles rather, to turn into yarn. That it also created stronger yarn than James Hargreaves' system. Now, Arkwright understood to make the most and utilise this new machine, he required a huge workforce to work with it. So he actually employed 600 people, typically rural families, large rural families, to live nearby a factory in cottage houses to work for him. And as you can see here, in 1771, the Cromford Mill was created. Now here, typically, women and children would maintain the water mill, clearing up loose debris of yarn, while weavers would stay in the cottages weaving the yarn into cloth. Now this is revolutionary because this set the standard of a lot of concepts we have in industry today, such as wages and shift hours and that sort of thing. Now this is all stimulated in accordance with transport as well. As we mentioned, canals were particularly expansive during this time period, as they were stimulated by the global trade, but also railway in the late 1850s, as you can see from this little diagram here. You can see areas like Bristol and London were highly dense on railway by the end of this time. This is because the trade necessitated it and allowed goods to be vitally transported, such as food. As a result, there's a lot of political implications. Now, unfortunately, we've only discussed the key advantages of developments of the Industrial Revolution. However, there are clear disadvantages. For example, the working class were clearly now identified as an agrarian society. It was harder to distinguish class, whereas now, working class were clearly identified as the industry workers and rural farmers, whereas aristocracy, such as the middle class, would be financial investors. Now, there would be clashes between these classes, as, for example, within Ludism. As production was being greater automated, it meant the need for manpower was less and less required, meant more people in unemployment. Now, unemployment during this time period was very undesirable, as workhouses and poor relief was very limited at this time and led to poverty. So as a result, women and men often would destroy factories as a revolt. Consequently, Chartism also happened, where people fought for democracy to get the man to vote within 1838. Now, some people would argue about the benefits of the capitalist nature, such as Adam Smith, saying it necessitates the trade needed to survive, whereas Marx would criticise it for its exploitative purposes. Now, the exploitation can be observed within the Combination Act of 1799 to 1800, which actually prohibited trade unions. Eventually, because of either revolt or good democracy, this would be attended to by the state, either through welfare policy, or even specifically for the 1832 Reform Act, which granted the electorate from 400,000 to 650,000. As previously, it was mainly aristocracy who had the right to vote. As you can see, eventual improvements would happen, although limited. As we can see from the diagram here, there is clear poverty and which is still rife within urban cities, which are disgusting places to live, as demonstrated through Chadwick's report. Also, poor relief had to slowly develop, as you can see. Now, industrialisation happened clearly in the 1800s, but national intervention was slow to keep up with it. To conclude, revolution directly or implicitly affected all aspects of British and eventually global society. As I mentioned, the industrial practices discussed can still have some semblance today. And that is an optimal combination of circumstances of British resources and innovation sparked the first industrial revolution. As we mentioned, advantages Britain had, such as the abundance of resources. The benefits and costs of the revolution definitely varied in your class backgrounds. So as a capitalist would have succeeded very much from the factories, poor people wouldn't. Here are my references for my arguments made, and here is my bibliography.